The Second Opium War occurred from 1856 to 1860, reigniting conflicts between China and Western powers, in particular Britain and France. It all began when Chinese authorities seized the Arrow, a vessel registered under the British flag, leading Britain to claim a violation of the Treaty of Nanjing. The war saw collaborative military actions led by Anglo-French forces, with key events including the capture of the Taku forts and the occupation of Beijing. The war ended with the Treaty of Tianjin and the Convention of Peking, which imposed even harsher conditions on China, including the legalization of the opium trade, the cession of Kowloon to Britain, and the establishment of foreign embassies in Beijing, treaties that further weakened the Qing dynasty and deepened China's century of humiliation. Welcome to the channel, everyone. Off we go for the Second Opium War today. No part 1 and 2 in this one, just all the way to the end. Of course, if you want to learn about the First Opium War, you might want to look at the link in the description. Watch those two videos first, part 1 and 2, and then you'll understand the context a little bit better. Now, as always, you're supporting the channel just by enjoying it, but liking and subscribing and perhaps telling your friends always helps. And if you want to go further beyond that, there's a few links in the description. But without further ado, let's get on with it. Now, we all know that the Second Opium War was ensuing as a direct consequence of the First Opium War. You see, the Treaty of Nanjing, signed in 1842, provided Britain with an indemnity and extraterritorial rights. It also allowed for the establishment of 5 treaty ports and the transfer of Hong Kong Island to British control. The treaty's inability, however, to meet British objectives of enhanced commercial and diplomatic ties resulted in the outbreak of this Second Opium War in 1856. In fact, the First Opium War is often regarded as a catalyst for the onset of modern Chinese history in China. What about the period between the two wars, though? What happened then? Well, it wasn't all peaceful. Of course, it couldn't be. There were multiple instances of hostility towards British citizens. I wonder why. But as a response, in 1847, an expedition to Canton was launched. Now, I'm sure you know if you've watched the first videos, Canton is modern-day Guangzhou. And if you don't know what that is, or where it is, or what it looks like, you might just want to type it into Google and pick up your jaw from the floor, because it's quite a lovely city. Now, this military operation successfully attacked and captured the forts of the Boca Tigris through a surprise attack, resulting in the disabling of 879 guns. And that wasn't all. During the 1850s, Western imperialism experienced significant and swift expansion. You see, the Western powers, they had the same objectives, more or less, including the enlargement of their international markets and the creation of new ports of call. You see, when you're sailing all across the world like they were, you can't really do it all in one go. You need to be able to stop, resupply. And, well, people need to be able to give you at least a good deal. You need to be welcome in these ports. And if you're not welcome in other people's ports, you must simply create your own or make other people's ports your ports. It's a tale as old as time. But you know that. Well, both the French Treaty of Huangpu and the American Wangxia Treaty included provisions that permitted the treaties to be re-evaluated and maybe even revised after a period of 12 years after their implementation. Now, Britain requested the Qing authorities in China to engage in further negotiations about the Treaty of Nanjing, which was signed in 1842, with the intention of broadening its rights and benefits. Well, this request was made based on Britain's claim of being a most favored nation. Now, what does that mean? Well, it was written into the Treaty of Nanjing that Britain would indeed become the most favored among the colonial powers. So we're talking the Russians, the Germans, French, Spanish, Portuguese, and some minor countries. But Britain was to be treated the best out of all of them, and that was written on contract. Well, but that wasn't all. The British demands encompassed the complete access of British merchant companies to all parts of China, the legalization of the opium trade, the exemption of foreign imports from internal transit duties, the eradication of piracy, and the regulation of the coolie trade, authorization for a British ambassador to reside in Beijing, and finally the establishment of the English language version of all treaties as superior to the Chinese language version. You can see how this can become a problem. Mistranslations, interpretations, legal jargon. Of course, you don't get away with this sort of thing in any country anymore. Most countries have the rules that the local language contract always supersedes the second language contract, and China is no exception. So, in order to allow Chinese merchant vessels operating in treaty ports the same privileges as British ships under the Treaty of Nanjing, British officials provided these vessels with British registration in Hong Kong. In October 1856, Chinese Marines in Canton apprehended a cargo ship named the Arrow on grounds of suspected piracy, and they detained 12 out of the 14 Chinese crew members. The Chinese government seized and later sold the Arrow. Now, at the time of its seizure, the ship was registered as British, but it was once employed by pirates, and it was continuing to display the British flag at the time of its capture, despite the fact that its registration had lapsed. The captain, Thomas Kennedy, who was on a nearby vessel at the time, witnessed Chinese Marines removing the British flag from the ship. Harry Parkes, the British consul in Canton, communicated with Ye Mingchen, the imperial commissioner and viceroy of Liangguang, that is the Guangdong and Guangxi, the two Guangs, to request the prompt release of the sailors and a formal apology for the purported offense against the flag. Well, Ye was always a little stubborn, but he did release the 9 crew members, but he withheld the release of the remaining 3. So, on October the 23rd, the British demolished 4 barrier forts. On October the 25th, a request was made for the British to be granted permission to enter Canton. On the following day, the British initiated an artillery attack on the city, launching a single round at intervals of 10 minutes. Ye Mingchen offered a reward for capturing the head of every British person. That's one way to make money, isn't it? Well, on the 29th of October, the Royal Navy forcefully breached the weakly fortified and insufficient walls. The U.S. consul, James Keenan, hoisted the flag of the United States on the walls and residence of Ye Mingchen in Canton when his troops entered. and the casualties amounted to 3 fatalities and 12 injuries. But still, the negotiations were unsuccessful, resulting in the city being bombarded. On November the 6th, a total of 23 war junks were attacked, and they were subsequently destroyed. There were, however, intermittent breaks for negotiations, during which the British still launched bombardments, resulting in the outbreak of fires. On the 3rd of March, 1857, the British administration was defeated in a parliamentary vote concerning the Arrow incident and the events that occurred in Canton till the end of the previous year. The outcome of this defeat prompted a general election in the April of 1857 and resulted in significant expansion of the government's majority. In April of the same year, the British government extended invitations to the United States of America and Russia for potential coalitions, but neither side was really keen on the idea. They were declined from both the Americans and the Russians. Well, it didn't help that in May of 1857 the Indian Mutiny escalated, prompting the British to redirect their forces from China to India, as it was seen as the more pressing matter. Well, in terms of France, they participated in the British intervention in China in response to grievances raised by their representative, Baron Jean-Baptiste Louis Gros. The accusations were regarding the death of a French missionary named Auguste Chapdelaine by local Chinese officials in the Guangxi province. It is important also to note, by the way, that Guangxi province was not accessible to foreigners during that period. So what exactly was the missionary doing there? Well, I suppose when you're on a mission from God, you go wherever the bloody hell you want, don't you? Just ask him. Either way, he didn't last too long. He got caught and they strung him up. So obviously the French were not pleased with that. Well, Admiral Sir Michael Seymour led a collaboration between the British and the French. In the latter part of 1857, a combined military force from Britain and France launched an assault on Canton and successfully took control of the city. A collaborative committee comprising members of the alliance was finally established. The Allies retained the city governor and his position to uphold on behalf of the victors. The British-French coalition exerted dominion over Canton for a duration of about 4 years. In May of 1858, the coalition swiftly advanced northward and successfully seized control of the Daku fort near Tianjin for a short period of time. The United States and Russia dispatched their own diplomats to Hong Kong, with the intention of providing military assistance to the British and the French. However, Russia did not provide any military aid. Well, during the war, the US participated in a simultaneous but small fight. However, it declined the UK's proposal for an alliance and did not cooperate with the Anglo-French forces. The Chinese garrison stationed in Canton initiated an attack on the United States Navy's steamer in 1856, which prompted the US Navy to respond with a counterattack, and this was known as the Battle of the Pearl River Forts. The ships launched a heavy bombardment of the river forts near Canton, subsequently launching an assault and successfully capturing them, without really much of a scratch on the American side. Subsequent to this, diplomatic endeavors were recommenced, resulting in the signing of an agreement between the American and Chinese governments, ensuring U.S. neutrality during the Second Opium War. Now in 1857, the following year, British troops began gathering in Hong Kong, where they were later joined by a contingent of French soldiers. By December 1857, they possessed an adequate number of ships and men to finally address the failure to fulfill the treaty duties that granted them right to enter Canton. Parkes issued a decisive demand, which was backed by the Hong Kong governor Sir John Bowring and Admiral Sir Michael Seymour, warning on 14th of December that Canton would be bombarded if the demands were not met within 24 hours. Remember those 3 remaining hostages, we could call them? They wanted them back. Well, I suppose you could argue, are 3 remaining hostages and a dead preacher worth starting an international conflict over? Well, if you're looking for an excuse to start a conflict, anything will do. Dare I say that they were certainly looking for an excuse, especially sitting in Hong Kong eyeing off the Kowloon, or as I'd call it in Mandarin, Zhoulong district. Well, you need some kind of excuse, don't you? Well, subsequently, the surviving crew members of the Arrow were set free, but they didn't receive any apologies from Viceroy Ye Ming-chen, who also declined to uphold the conditions of the contract. Seymour, Major General Van Straubenzee, and Admiral de Genoli devised a strategy to assault Canton in accordance with orders. The action was thereafter referred to as the Arrow Incident, which also gave rise to the alternate name for the subsequent conflict. It's also called the War of the Arrow, but I think the Second Opium War sounds a lot cooler. It has a better ring to it. Now, it was actually more about the arrow than it was the opium, so, we could argue that we should probably be calling it the Arrow War, but, well, it's a little too late for that, isn't it? Well, despite being hindered by the Indian Rebellion of 1857, which we mentioned, the British did proceed to retaliate against the Arrow Incident in 1856 by launching an assault on Guangzhou from the Pearl River. Viceroy Ye Ming-chen issued a directive instructing all Chinese soldiers stationed at the forts to refrain from opposing the British advance. Following the effortless capture of the fort near Canton, the British Army proceeded for an all-out attack on the city. The seizure of Canton on the 1st of January 1858, a metropolis inhabited by more than 1 million people, but taken by a mere 6,000 soldiers, led to the British and French armies sustaining only 15 fatalities and 13 injuries. Thoroughly ratioed. Between 200 and 650 of the defenders and residents suffered casualties. Now, Ye Ming-chen was apprehended, and he was subsequently banished to Calcutta, India, where he deliberately deprived himself of food until he starved to death. And in these days, Ye Ming-chen is kind of seen as a bit of a, I'm not sure if we can say hero, but perhaps a role model for not giving in to the British and the French ever. He stayed in his residence while it was being bombed and they were battering down the door, sitting at his desk, just thoroughly shaking his head. You'll have to break the door down, because I'm not opening it for you. Well, in January there was a potential plot to poison John Bowring and his family in Hong Kong, which is now referred to as the Essing Bakery incident. Now, it's a bit of a mystery whether it was all intentional or not, but if the act was intentional, the baker who was accused of contaminating bread with arsenic made a little bit of mistake by adding an excessive amount of poison to the dough. As a result, the victims vomited a significant quantity of the poison, leaving them with only non-lethal amounts remaining in their bodies. Messengers were dispatched with a warning, thus halting any additional harm. Well, upon its recognition in Britain, the Arrow incident, along with the reaction of the British military, sparked a significant amount of debate. On the 3rd of March, there was a vote, and a motion was carried by a vote of 263 to 49, expressing opposition to the government, and this is an excerpt from the minutes of that meeting. This House has heard with the concern of the conflicts which have occurred between the British and Chinese authorities on the Canton River, and without expressing an opinion as to the extent to which the government of China may have afforded this country cause of complaint respecting the non-fulfillment of the Treaty of 1842, this House considers that the papers which have been laid on the table fail to establish satisfactory grounds for the violent measures at Canton in the late affair of the Arrow, and that a select committee be appointed to inquire into the state of our commercial relations with China. End of the excerpt from the minutes. Now, Lord Palmerston, the Prime Minister of the Whig Party, criticized the patriotism of the Whigs, who supported the resolution. As a result, Parliament was dissolved, leading to the British general election in 1857. Now, the Chinese matter played a significant role in the election, in which Palmerston secured a larger majority, thereby suppressing the opinions of the Whig faction members who were in favor of the Chinese side. Basically a pro-trade faction and a pro-war faction. Well, the newly established Parliament has resolved to pursue compensation from China, relying on the report of the Arrow incident presented by Henry Parkes. And Britain requested the French Empire, the United States, and the Russian Empire to create an alliance. The first phase of the conflict concluded in June of 1158 by signing of the 4 treaties of Tianjin, involving Britain, France, Russia, and the US. Now, these treaties expanded Western commercial access to an additional 11 ports. Initially, the Chinese declined to formally approve these treaties, but, what choice do you have? Now, the key provisions were as follows: that Britain, France, Russia, and the United States would have the right to establish diplomatic legations, that being small embassies in Beijing, which was a closed city at the time. Also, 10 more Chinese ports would be opened for foreign trade, including Niuzhuang, Tamshui, Hankou, and Nanjing. The right of all foreign vessels, including commercial ships, to navigate freely on the Yangtze River, the right of foreigners to travel in the internal regions of China which had been formerly banned, and also China was to pay an indemnity of 4 million taels of silver to Britain and 2 million to France. Well, the Treaty of Aigun was signed on the 28th of May 1158 to amend the Chinese and Russian border, which had been established by the Nerchinsk Treaty of 1689. Russia acquired the territory on the left side of the Amur River, therefore extending the southern border beyond the Stanovoy Mountains. The Convention of Peking in 1860 granted Russia jurisdiction over a region on the Pacific coast that remains ice-free, leading to the establishment of the city of Vladivostok in the same year. And that is, to this day, right on the Chinese border, up sort of near Harbin. Well, in June of 1158, shortly after the Qing imperial court consented to the unfavorable treaties, albeit not very happily so, the assertive ministers convinced the Xianfeng emperor to oppose Western intrusion. Signed agreements be damned. Thus, on June 2nd, 1858, the Xianfeng emperor commanded the Mongol general Senge Rinchen to protect the Taku forts, located near Tianjin. Senge Rinchen reinforced the fortifications by adding supplementary artillery units. In addition, he enlisted 4,000 Mongol cavalry from the regions of Chahar and Suiyuan. And thus we arrive at the Second Battle of the Taku Forts, which are also known as the Dagu Forts in the modern-day Chinese vernacular. This was in June of 1159. An armada of 21 vessels, including 2,000 British troops led by Admiral Sir James Hope, embarked on a voyage from Shanghai to Tianjin. Their mission was to transport recently appointed Anglo-French diplomats to the embassies in Beijing. They navigated the estuary of the Hai River, which was protected by those Taku forts. Of course, they insisted on proceeding further inland to Beijing, and Senge Rinchen said that the Anglo-French envoys may potentially arrive on the coast of Beitang and then continue their journey to Beijing. However, he declined to permit the presence of foreign armed forces accompanying them to the Chinese capital, for obvious reasons. The Anglo-French forces insisted on disembarking at Taku instead of Beitang and accompanying the foreign diplomats to Beijing. During the evening of June 24th, 1859, a small contingent of British troops detonated the iron barriers that the Chinese had positioned in the Baihe River. By the way, Baihe River means White River River, so in Chinese you'll just say Baihe. Now, on the following day, the British soldiers attempted to forcefully navigate into the river and bombarded the Taku forts. The inability to dock due to low tide and the presence of soft mud hindered their progress, but nevertheless, Senge Rinchen's cannons effectively sank 4 gunboats and caused quite a bit of damage to 2 more. Despite being instructed to remain neutral, the American Commodore Josiah Tatnall defied these orders and stated that familial ties are stronger than alliances. He then proceeded to deliver defensive gunfire to safeguard the British convoy's withdrawal. The inability to capture the Taku forts dealt a significant damage to the reputation of the British, leading to a peak in opposition against the foreigners within the Qing imperial court. Of course, if there is a hope that the foreigners can be defeated, a few more people are brave enough to openly stand up against them. Back in India, that old mutiny was well and truly suppressed, and after it was all finished up, the Sir Colin Campbell, Commander-in-Chief of India, had the opportunity to gather men and resources for a further military campaign in China. Known as a military leader who was favored by the soldiers, Campbell's first-hand experience of disease-related casualties during the First Opium War prompted him to ensure that the British forces were adequately equipped with ample materials and supplies, resulting in a relatively low number of casualties. And thus the Third Battle of the Taku Forts occurred during the summer of 1860. London once again sent Lord Elgin with a combined army of 11,000 British troops led by General James Hope Grant, and 6,700 French troops led by General Cousin Mountaban. They advanced in a northerly direction with a fleet of 173 ships originating from Hong Kong. Their objective was to conquer the port cities of Yantai and Dalian in order to secure control over the Bohai Gulf. On the 3rd of August, they executed a landing close to Beitang, around 3 kilometers away from the Taku forts. They successfully seized control of the forts after a duration of 3 weeks on the 21st of August. Now, the southern Chinese laborers, and quite a few of them, were enlisted in the military armies of both the French and the British. In fact, an eyewitness account states that the Chinese laborers, despite being considered traitors, served the British with loyalty and enthusiasm. During the attack on the Peiho forts in 1860, they carried the French ladders to the moat, and, standing in the water up to their necks, used their hands to support the ladders, allowing the storming party to cross. Now, it was pretty uncommon to involve them in warfare, but they did show remarkable calmness in facing the risks of distant fire. They show a tremendous eagerness to confront their fellow countrymen and fight them to the death, using their bamboo weapons. Well, if you ever watch any films about whether it be the Sino-Japanese War or any films about the Century of Humiliation, really, the running trend in Chinese films is always those traitors, the Efialtes sort of characters, always there. It's one thing to be a foreign barbarian, as they call them, but it's another thing to sell out your own people when times are already bad enough as it is. Well, upon capturing Tianjin on the 23rd of August 1860, it was reported that the British had abducted the prefect of Tianjin, as conveyed by the imperial messenger. In retribution, Parkes was apprehended on the 18th of September. In addition, several British and French officers, Sikh soldiers, and a writer from the Times were also taken into custody. Parkes and the others were incarcerated, subject to a little bit of torture, and subjected to questioning, which I'm sure the questioning was just more torture. Well, at least it was perhaps a little break from the torture. Well, the captives endured the torture of being binded up with rope, resulting in lacerations and subsequent maggot infestations in their flesh. Additionally, they were subjected to the forceful introduction of excrement and filth down their throats. Multiple individuals were sent to execution via decapitation, and their lifeless bodies were subsequently provided as sustenance to animals. The captured laborers who had labored for the Allies were subjected to a cruel punishment where they were buried up to their necks and left to have their faces chewed off by hungry dogs. Yeah, you don't want to get caught by the Qing government, that's for sure. Now, the Anglo-French forces engaged in combat with Senge Rinzhen's Mongol cavalry on the 18th of September at the Battle of Jiangjiawan before advancing towards the outskirts of Beijing for a more decisive engagement in Tongzhou. On the 21st of September, at Bali Chao, the 8-mile bridge, Senge Rinchen's army of 10,000 soldiers, which included the highly skilled Mongol cavalry, was completely destroyed when they rather foolishly attacked head-on against the overwhelming firepower of the combined Anglo-French forces. The French military forces reached the summer palace located outside of Beijing on October 6th, and the British troops landed there a day after. Following the severe defeat of the Qing army, the Xianfeng Emperor abandoned the city and entrusted his brother, Prince Gong, with the responsibility of leading the peace negotiations. Xianfeng initially sought refuge at the Chengde Summer Palace, before eventually relocating to Rehe province. Anglo-French forces commenced the plundering of the Summer Palace and the Old Summer Palace straight away, and all of these sites were completely filled with rich artwork and all sorts of very valuable things from the old times of China, many of which have still not been returned. Everybody in China knows about the looting of the Summer Palace. Well, following the liberation of Parks and the remaining detainees on the 8th of October, the ones that survived, that is, the full nature of their abuse became evident. The potential demolition of the Forbidden City was, debated about, as suggested by Lord Elgin, with the aim of dissuading the Qing Empire from employing kidnapping as a means of negotiation and seeking retribution for the ill treatment of their captives. Nevertheless, an assault on Beijing was excluded, as it had previously been declared as a menace in previous instances. Elgin did make the decision to set fire to the Summer Palace, however, destroy the whole thing. He clarified in a written correspondence that the destruction of the palace was the retribution that would be imposed solely upon the emperor, who, as he thought, was directly responsible for the committed offense, rather than the people, who may be relatively blameless. So instead of attacking the city with all of those casualties that would no doubt result from the bombardment, simply destroy the emperor's little summer home. Well, perhaps the lesser of two evils, maybe, depending on how you look at it. Still, the loss of the Summer Palace is a tragedy. Imagine if somebody were to invade London and they destroyed Westminster Abbey. Think about it like that. Well, on October the 18th, the British troops set fire to the Old Summer Palace. They asked the French for a little help, but they declined to provide assistance. The demolition of the structures was completed within a span of 2 days, during which the adjacent imperial property was also annihilated. According to most sources, the Old Summer Palace was engulfed in flames for a duration of 3 days and 3 nights. Both Britain and France then issued campaign medals for their involvement in the Second China War and the 1860 China expedition, respectively. The British medal was adorned with the following clasps. China was involved in several conflicts during the 19th century, including the First Opium War, the Foshan and Canton conflicts, the Taku Forts conflicts in 1858 and 60, and the Peking conflict in 1860. Well, on October the 24th, some week later, Prince Gong, the emperor's brother, acquiesced to the demands of the Allied forces, as the emperor had already fled to Chengde on the September 22nd. British and French forces arrived in Beijing, where the Treaty of Tianjin was officially approved at the Convention of Beijing. the 1408 Ming Dynasty Yongle Encyclopedia, which was the greatest encyclopedia ever compiled in global history at that time, suffered significant damage during the sack of Beijing by the foreign armies, and as a result, just 3.5% of the original volumes have survived to this day. And that's just one of the things that we lost. The British, French, and Russians were all given lasting diplomatic presence in Beijing. And despite the Qing Emperor's resistance due to the implication of equality between China and the European powers, well, China was forced to pay a total of 8 million taels of silver to both Britain and France. Kowloon was relinquished to the British control and became a part of the British-owned territory of Hong Kong. The opium trade was officially given the green light, and Christians were given complete civil rights, including the ability to possess property and the right to engage in evangelism. Well, after a period of 2 weeks, Ignatieff exerted pressure on the Qing government to sign a supplementary Treaty of Beijing. This treaty resulted in the transfer of the maritime provinces located east of the Ussuri River, which were part of Outer Manchuria, to the Russians. Subsequently, the Russians established the port of Vladivostok between 1860 and 61. And the British press celebrated the Anglo-French victory as a great success for British Prime Minister Lord Palmerston, which significantly boosted his popularity. But I personally think Pitt the Elder is the better Prime Minister. Well, British businessmen were thrilled by the potential for trade and growth in the Far East, of course, a market that was surely had lots of untapped potential. Other foreign nations were also satisfied with the result, as they anticipated benefiting from China's decision to open up, or rather, the decision to open China up. Well, as for the Chinese, they were certainly feeling rather sore and sorry for themselves. The Qing army's defeat by a comparatively tiny Anglo-French military force, although being outnumbered by at least 10 to 1, along with the escape and eventual death of the Shenfeng Emperor and the destruction of the Summer Palace, dealt a decisive blow to the dominant Qing Empire. Undoubtedly, by 1860, the Western powers had decisively conquered and subjected the ancient Chinese civilization, inflicting deep humiliation upon them. Following the war, China embarked on significant modernization efforts called the Self-Strengthening Movement, which led to the initiation of various institutional reforms. Due to the Qing government's growing financial obligations and the need to safeguard Westerners after their defeat in the Second Opium War and the imposition of the unequal treaties, opposition to Qing rule escalated. Now, William Ewart Gladstone, a former British Prime Minister, was actually very vocal in his opposition to the opium trade. So don't think that everybody in Britain was all on the same side with this, because they certainly were not. Gladstone described the opium traffic between China and British India as most infamous and atrocious. He also vehemently opposed both of the Opium Wars, expressing strong disapproval of the British trade in opium to China and condemning British aggression towards the Chinese. In May of 1840, Gladstone strongly criticized it as Palmerston's Opium War, and expressed his fear of divine retribution upon England for its unjust treatment of the Chinese. Gladstone delivered a renowned address in Parliament denouncing the First Opium War, condemning it as a, quote, conflict that was even more unjust in its inception, a conflict that was even more deliberate in its advancement, resulting in a lasting stain on this nation's reputation. Now, the reason for his animosity for opium in general was the impact it had on his own sister, Helen. When Gladstone initially hesitated to join Robert Peel's ministry in 1841 due to his strong aversion towards the Opium War, which was instigated by Palmerston. And with that, we end the video on the Second Opium War. I hope you enjoyed it. Interesting stuff, isn't it? I just wish they hadn't burned down the Summer Palace. I remember being in Beijing. It's one of those things that you just, well, you know that it would have been as great as the Forbidden City if you could see it. The Forbidden City, by the way, is beautiful. Imagine if they had have destroyed that. Imagine what the world could have lost. Anyway, I'd like to thank the top-tier supporters and patrons: Dark, Kerry, Kimberly, Ember, Ben, Britt, Charles, Aaron, James, Jeffrey, Melissa, Scott, Stark Factory, and Wendy. Thank you very much, everyone, and I will see you tomorrow for more history. Same time, same place, right here on YouTube. Lots of love to you all. Get a good rest. Good night.